Okay. All right. So we'll start again. All right, so the motor neuron generates action potential. That action potential causes the release of acetylcholine. That acetylcholine then binds to receptors on the sarcolemma of the skeletal muscle fiber. Those receptors are attached to sodium channels, causing the sodium channels to open. That causes a depolarization. That depolarization, if significant enough, causes an action potential. That action potential spreads across the entire skeletal muscle fiber, causing the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. That calcium, what does it do? It binds to proteins on the actin filament, freeing up the myosin binding site. So now the myosin heads can bind to the actin filaments, and they do the power stroke, and that results in the skeletal muscle fiber contracting. So notice I have a basic outline here. I didn't get into all the great details and what have you. It's not necessary. When all you need is a sort of outline, and you can sort of fill in the gaps and the details as you're explaining it to yourself. Now, again, you don't have to have something that's exactly like this, but there should be a flow chart that makes sense to you. You're using this as a study tool. Okay? Okay, so let's move on to our next topic. Our next topic is going to be about how energy is provided for muscle contraction. Obviously, energy is needed for muscle contraction. Energy, if you recall, is the capacity to do work, right? It's the capacity to do work. Okay? So, energy is going to be needed for muscle contraction. So, we're going to explain why ATP is required for skeletal muscle contraction. And we're going to describe the sources of ATP for skeletal muscle fiber contraction. We're also going to explain oxygen debt and list the components and explain the fate of lactic acid after exercise ceases. And we're going to explain muscle fatigue. Okay? Now let me pause for just a second here because I do want to make sure. That I am indeed, yes, I am recording. Okay. I was afraid I may have clicked the button twice because that does happen sometimes. Okay. All right. So let's talk about how ATP is provided for skeletal muscle contraction. So why do we need ATP for skeletal muscle contraction? Okay. Well, first, remember that every time there's an action potential being produced in the neurons, also in the skeletal muscle fibers, you have to have a repolarization of the membrane. So you're going to have sodium potassium pumps that are going to be active all the time, and they require ATP. Remember, it's a sodium potassium ATPase pump. Second, in order for those myosin heads to be released and to recock for reattachment, that requires ATP. Otherwise, they're fixed, locked in place. So just for contraction at the sarcomeres itself, ATP is required. Okay, and also, basically think of any movement that's associated with contraction. So the release of neurotransmitters, the reuptake of neurotransmitters, right? You got all these things moving around, and they require ATP. So ATP is required for many, many aspects of muscle contraction. Okay? In the absence of ATP, a muscle will fail to contract even when it's stimulated by acetylcholine. That is what is considered fatigue. Okay? All right. So energy from muscle contraction initially comes, excuse me, from ATP that is stored in the muscle. So I want you to think of this. Oh, I'm not on the slides? Oh, I'm just completely screwing up today. I am sorry, guys. I thought I had. Okay. Are the slides being shared yet? Okay, there they are. Egad. All right. Take 3. So ATP is required in order for muscle fibers to contract. Now I want you to consider this. Let's say we were all going to run for 30 minutes, okay, or bike for 30 minutes. So we're going to do some type of aerobic activity for 30 minutes. So we take off running or biking or whatever. Where does that initial ATP come from? It comes from ATP that's stored in the muscles. So for the first 4 to 6 seconds of our exercise, the ATP is coming from cells in the muscles. It's just stored. But we only have about 4 to 6 seconds worth. So what happens after we're 4 to 6 seconds into our run? Well, we've got to get ATP from other pathways. So 4 to 6 seconds after we started our run, there is this molecule called creatine phosphate that will donate a phosphate to ADP in the cytoplasm of the skeletal muscle fibers to regenerate some ATP. But we've only got about 15 seconds worth of creatine phosphate, right? So this gets us into about, what, 20, 22 seconds into our run, okay? Now, creatine phosphate, you may have heard of people taking creatine monohydrate. They take it because it's converted to creatine phosphate. And what this does is this gives people when they start exercising, it gives them a quick burst of energy. Well, who needs a quick burst of energy? Well, if you're trying to build muscle mass where you're lifting very heavy weights for just a few repetitions, you need a quick burst of energy, right? So bodybuilders, people who are trying to put on muscle will load up on creatine monohydrate, which is converted to creatine phosphate to get that big burst of energy when they work out. So we're about 15 to 20 seconds into our run. We've got ATP. For the first 4 seconds, ATP came from what was stored in the skeletal muscles. Then we had about 15 more seconds from creatine phosphate. But after that, the creatine phosphate stores of ATP are gone. So where do we get it from after that? Well, now the heart and our lungs have had time to catch up. When we've initially started running, were we breathing hard? No. Did we have an elevation in our heart rate? No. But within that first 20 seconds, our heart rate has increased, our breathing has increased, and so now there's a significant amount of oxygen that's being delivered to our muscle cells in order to produce ATP through a process called aerobic respiration. So what happens is glucose or other molecules are converted to pyruvic acid in the cytoplasm. Now notice this process does not require oxygen. It's what's called anaerobic respiration. And we do get a little ATP, but not much. After being converted to pyruvic acid, that pyruvic acid then moves into the mitochondrion. And in the mitochondrion, oxygen is used to transfer energy from the pyruvic acid into ATP. And carbon dioxide and water are the byproducts. Remember, the mitochondria is responsible for most of the energy production that occurs in the cell. And this is why we require oxygen, and it's why we produce carbon dioxide. Now, this process is very efficient. So for every molecule of glucose, you get 36 ATP. So you get lots of ATP. But there's 2 problems. One, it requires oxygen. And this is a relatively slow process. So it's very easy to run out of ATP. Now, I want to focus on this step that occurs prior to aerobic respiration. That is, prior to pyruvic acid moving into the mitochondrion where oxygen is used to make ATP. This area here, this conversion of glucose to pyruvic acid produces a little ATP and doesn't require oxygen. And it is faster than aerobic respiration. So in situations where your muscles can't produce enough ATP to keep up with the ATP needs of your skeletal muscle fibers, this process will actually occur faster than this process, right? It'll give you a little more ATP. You don't need oxygen, so if you're not getting enough oxygen to your cells, to your skeletal muscle fibers to get enough ATP that you need from aerobic respiration, you can produce some by anaerobic respiration. But there's two problems. One, it's not efficient. For every glucose molecule, you only get like, I think, 2 ATPs, so it's not efficient at all. And this pyruvic acid is an acid, and it will drop the pH of the cell, causing the cell not to work, not to function as efficiently. So that pyruvic acid can very quickly become toxic to the cell. So that pyruvic acid is temporarily converted to lactic acid. This is just a sort of a fleshed out version of this right here. Okay, this pyruvic acid is temporarily converted to lactic acid, but it's still an acid, so it can still drop the pH in the cytoplasm of the skeletal muscle fiber. So lactic acid is what's responsible for that burning sensation that you have if you're exercising a muscle that you haven't exercised in a while. It's basically an indication that you're producing ATP anaerobically because you can't produce enough aerobically to support the level of activity that you're requiring of your skeletal muscle fibers. That's why if you haven't run in a while or done an exercise in a while, you'll get that burning sensation. So as I was saying, anaerobic respiration occurs faster than aerobic respiration, and it doesn't require oxygen. But the downside is it's not very efficient, and you end up with lactic acid, which itself can produce muscle fatigue. I need to update the slide. At one time, it was thought that it also produced muscle soreness, but that's just damage to your skeletal muscles and the subsequent inflammation that occurs just by working a muscle very hard. Alrighty, so we started running. For the first 4 to 6 seconds, our ATP came from stored ATP. Then we got about 20 more seconds of ATP from creatine phosphate. Then for the duration, the remaining duration of our run, most of the ATP came from aerobic respiration, and we may have gotten a little from anaerobic respiration. And so now we're at 30 minutes and we stop running. But even though we stop running, what do we continue to do? Our respiration rate continues to be elevated, and our heart rate continues to be elevated. Well, we're no longer running. Why is that the case? Well, we have built up over that period of exercise an oxygen debt. In other words, we created some ATP to meet the needs of our skeletal muscle fibers without using oxygen. It's sort of like if you were to go shopping. First, you start paying with money that you had, and then maybe you wanted to buy something that you really didn't have the money for, and so you put it on the credit card. But as you know, eventually you're going to have to pay that credit card debt, right? So you created this oxygen debt, which represents any ATP that was produced without oxygen, right? So at the end of this period of exercise, we got to pay we got to pay this oxygen debt back. So this oxygen debt must be repaid to tissues. A large part of that oxygen debt is that lactic acid that's built up. It built up during the period of time we were exercising. Now we've got to pay it back. So what happens? We've got this lactic acid that has been produced during the course of our exercise. That lactic acid is going to be converted to pyruvic acid, back to pyruvic acid rather. And then some of that pyruvic acid is going to enter the mitochondrion to make ATP. So remember, we used up those initial stores of ATP. Well, we have to replace them. Also, we used up those initial stores of creatine phosphate. We have to replace those as well. And some pyruvic acid enters the blood and the liver uses it to make glucose and then store that glucose as glycogen. So those are all of the things that are occurring after exercise ceases, but you continue to have an elevated blood pressure and heart rate and respiration rate. We're paying back that oxygen debt. We're replenishing those ATP stores through aerobic respiration. Okay, I want to stop here and address any questions you may have. You can text or you can mute your microphone. I'm sorry, unmute your microphone. Well, if there are no questions, I'm going to move on to exercise and the effects on muscles. First, we're going to contrast isometric and isotonic contraction. We're going to describe isometric and resistance exercise and the effects on skeletal muscles. And we're going to describe endurance or aerobic exercise and the effects on skeletal muscles and other organ systems. Before I go to the next topic, I emailed you this learning activity. This learning activity basically covers what we just talked about with respect to the topic of how skeletal muscle fibers get ATP for muscle contraction. All right, so complete this outside class and then we'll go over this on Monday. Okay, let's talk about isotonic contractions. So we're going to contrast isotonic contractions with isometric contractions. So does anyone remember what iso means? Just think about it for a second. Remember hypertonic, hypotonic, and isotonic? Remember when a cell was in an isotonic solution, the concentration inside the cell and outside the cell were the same. Iso means same. Isotonic contraction means same tone or same tension. An isotonic contraction occurs when a muscle shortens and the load moves. With an isometric contraction, again, iso meaning same, metric referring to length, the tension in the muscles increases, but the muscle does not shorten and the load does not move. So isometric is length, isotonic is same tension. Okay. Let me share with you examples of each of these. And I'm actually going to see if I can do this so everyone can see. Right? Okay, let me back up just a little bit. Okay. Actually, okay. All right. So isometric, meaning same length. Okay. So here I have, and hopefully everybody can see this. Okay. All right. So focus on my biceps brachia here. Right. So my biceps brachia is producing enough tension to resist the pull of gravity on my hand. Okay. Because my forearm is not moving, this is an isometric contraction, same length. Now I can take this 10-pound weight and place it here in the palm of my hand, right? And I can tell you, I could feel my muscles here tense up. They're contracting, but because they did not shorten, this is an isometric contraction. And I can put more and more and more and more weight, and they'll do more and more and more contraction. But because they don't move, it's isometric. Same length. Now, if I start contracting these muscles more and more, the moment that I overcome the pull of gravity on this weight and this muscle and this load moves, right, then it's isotonic, right? It's the length of this muscle is changing. So here I'm isometric, isotonic. As I'm moving this weight, I'm not producing any more tension, but the length of the muscle is changing. So it moves from isometric to isotonic. Okay. Now notice with normal movements, there is an isometric component and an isotonic component. I mean, think about anytime you like grab something and you're going to move it. When you grab it, your muscles tense up right before it moves. That's the isometric component. And then the moment it moves, then you move from isometric to isotonic. Okay? So that's the difference between an isometric contraction and an isotonic contraction. Okay? Are there any questions about that? Right? Makes, on paper, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but then when you actually can demonstrate it, then it makes perfectly good sense. Okay. So isotonic contractions, isometric contractions. Just remember, iso means same. Iso, same tone. Isotonic, same tone or same tension. Isometric, same length. Alrighty, so now let's talk about the effects of exercise on the muscular system. First, let's talk about aerobic or endurance exercise. Now, aerobic or endurance exercise, okay, let me share my screen. I just noticed I wasn't doing that. Okay. So we're talking about the effects of exercise on muscles. First, we're going to talk about aerobic or endurance exercises. Now, these are exercises where there's a relatively low load on your muscles. So your muscles are producing a relatively small amount of tension, but over a long period of time. Like typically, if you do something like aerobics or jogging or biking, it's a relatively low load that you're putting on your muscles, but you're working them over long periods of time, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, hours if you're like doing a marathon or what have you. So what limits how long you can engage in aerobic or endurance exercise? Like what limits how long you can do aerobics or how long you can jog or how long you can bike before you're just completely fatigued? Well, what limits how long you can engage in aerobic or endurance exercise is how quickly your muscles can produce ATP. So in other words, aerobic respiration. So if you push your muscles to the limits of how quickly they can produce ATP, how are they going to respond? Well, they're going to change in ways that will allow them to more efficiently produce ATP. And some of those changes occur in your muscles themselves, and some changes occur outside of your muscles. So anyone who's ever started an aerobic exercise program, like running or biking or jogging or whatever, you know, you first start off and you can't exercise very long. And when you do exercise, you get fatigued very quickly. You get tired very quickly. Your muscles produce that, lactic acid, and you have that burning sensation. And then when you stop, right, you've built up quite a bit of an oxygen debt, right? You're huffing and puffing, it seems like forever. But if you continue to regularly engage in that aerobic exercise, then you find that you're not as winded when you're done. You can go for much longer, and you don't have that lactic acid buildup. So how are your muscle cells changing, or how body in general changing to more efficiently produce ATP? So in other words, what's the effect of these aerobic and endurance exercises on your muscles? Well, if the issue is there's a limit to how much ATP your muscle cells can produce aerobically, they're going to make some changes so they can produce more. First, literally new capillaries grow toward your skeletal muscles. So this increases the blood supply to your skeletal muscles. And of course, that's going to result in an increased supply of oxygen. So now we've got more oxygen being delivered to your skeletal muscles. Well, that's great, because most ATP is going to come from aerobic respiration. But if we deliver more oxygen to the skeletal muscle fibers, but we don't have enough mitochondria to utilize that oxygen, then we'd be in the same place. So the skeletal muscle fibers literally create more mitochondria. So now we have a greater supply of oxygen, and we have a greater number of mitochondria to utilize that oxygen to make ATP. People who run marathons, or elite athletes that do aerobic exercises for hours on end, right? When you look at their skeletal muscle fibers, they are teeming with mitochondria. Some other changes that occur in the body outside of the muscular system include an increase in the efficiency of one's lungs. Metabolism in general is more efficient, and we also see enhances in muscle coordination. Some other benefits of aerobic exercise also include a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease, decreased risk of hypertension, decreased risk of diabetes. Okay, so all of those benefits come with engaging in aerobic or endurance exercise, in addition to increasing the supply of oxygen to cells, skeletal muscle fibers, so they can produce more ATP. Okay, by allowing those skeletal muscle fibers to more efficiently produce more ATP aerobically, that is what increases endurance or increases resistance to fatigue. Now, what is not associated with aerobic or endurance exercise is an increase in the size of the cells or in the size of the skeletal muscles, right? Most of these changes don't really result in an increase in the size of skeletal muscles. So if you're trying to look buff or look good naked, aerobic or endurance exercise is not what you want to engage in. If you're trying to increase your endurance, and if you want health benefits, that's the way to go. But if you're actually trying to build muscle mass, then you want to engage in what's called resistance or isometric exercise. Now, this involves moving immovable or nearly immovable loads over short periods of time. And when I say immovable or nearly immovable, basically taking a weight that you can barely move. Maybe you can bench press it, or you can curl it 3, 4, 5 times, and then that's it. Okay, now in this situation, it is not a lack of oxygen or a lack of energy that prevents you from moving the weight. It's a lack of strength. Your skeletal muscles literally can't produce enough tension to move the weights or to move them that often. And so here, your body, your muscles specifically, make changes that will increase the amount of tension that they can produce. Well, what causes tension in a skeletal muscle fiber? Just think about that for just a second. What actually is causing the tension in the skeletal muscle fiber? If you said it's the myosin heads binding to the actin filaments, that's exactly right. What actually causes the production of tension is when those myosin heads bind to the actin filaments and do the power stroke. So if a skeletal muscle fiber wants to produce more tension, it's got to build more actin and myosin filaments. Well, skeletal muscle fibers are filled with myofibrils. So if they build bigger myofibrils or more myofibrils that have more actin and myosin filaments, they've got to get bigger, right? Because it's not like there's space sitting in those skeletal muscle fibers. So when one engages in resistance or isometric exercise, what happens is new myofibrils are produced. Myofibrils take up space, so the skeletal muscle cells grow in size. Well, if the skeletal muscle cells grow in size, then that means that the skeletal muscles themselves have to grow in size. And that, right? So you have a greater, you have more myofibrils, bigger skeletal muscle fibers, and therefore you end up with larger skeletal muscles, and those larger skeletal muscles can produce a greater amount of strength or tension. So this gentleman here has relatively the same number of skeletal muscle fibers that you and I have. His are just much, much larger. So if you're trying to build muscle mass, you want to engage in resistance or isometric exercises. It's not going to do a lot for endurance. There's not going to be a lot of health benefits per se. But if you want to increase strength and you want to increase increase the size of your muscles, right? Resistance and isometric is the type of exercise you want to engage in. Okay. Probably if you're looking at health benefits, you want to do a little of both, resistance and isometric in addition to endurance. Okay, so let's stop here. We are at the end, and this is ending on page 1. In the old book, it was page 196. I think it's 198 on this one. So this is a good place to stop and ask some questions, and it looks like there is a question up right now. So bear with me just a second as I switch back here. Okay, so get to my... Okay, so Eli asked, so you're asking about, what kind of regression occurs if you're if you're engaging in aerobic exercise and then you stop. Well, believe it or not, do you see regression? Yes, but the benefits of aerobic exercise actually last for a very long time. Now, exactly how long I couldn't tell you, but I'd say that you wouldn't completely regress from where you were before, even as far out as 6 months. I can tell you that from personal experience. In fact, it was years ago I started running, and the first time I ran, I can tell you there was a lot of discomfort. Let me put it that way. And I always stop running during the winter because it's cold. I don't run in the winter. And I have whenever I start running again, of course, you know, you're not where you were when you stopped running, but I have never gone back to where I was originally, right? And then also talking with a doctor about this, the benefits of aerobic exercise stay with you for quite a while. It'd be hard for me to tell you to put an actual number on it, though. Okay, you're welcome. Other questions? Feel free to use the raising hand feature and and ask questions. Unmute your mic. Okay, question, pyruvic acid. What happens to pyruvic acid? Certainly. So gosh darn it, during aerobic respiration, the step before aerobic respiration is anaerobic respiration, where glucose is converted to pyruvic acid, you get a little ATP. Well, if you can't have enough, you don't have enough ATP being produced aerobically, then there's an increase in the anaerobic, and so you got a buildup of pyruvic acid because it's being produced faster than it's being used, right? So just think of this as being like a traffic jam or a bottleneck, right? It's being produced faster than it's being used. So it builds up and it's temporarily converted to lactic acid. Okay. But then after exercise ceases, that lactic acid is converted back to pyruvic acid, and then that pyruvic acid goes one of two places. One, it goes into the mitochondria for the production of ATP to replace the ATP that was used up initially. And it also can be converted back to glucose and stored as glycogen in the liver. Okay, you're very welcome. Other questions? Okay, we've got about 6 minutes. I am going to take that time to at least introduce the endocrine system. We're not going to get any farther than that. I will tell you that on Monday, we're going to review a little bit on the muscular system, give you a chance to ask some questions after you've had time to sort of go over the material this weekend, and then I will assign a quiz on Monday on the muscular system. Okay, so our next organ system is the endocrine system. So we covered the nervous system, which was one of our controlling systems. Our second or sister controlling system is the endocrine system, and this is chapter 9. So let's start off by at least explaining the functions of the endocrine system, listing several major processes that are controlled by the endocrine system, And then if we have time, we'll define a hormone and we'll identify the location of some major organs of the human, major organs of the endocrine system of the human body. Okay, so what is the function of the endocrine system? Well, it coordinates and directs the activity of body cells. Along with the nervous system, it controls other organ systems. The nervous system was the fast controlling system. This is the slow, steady controlling system. It controls processes that are either continuously going or that occur over long periods of time, like growth and maturation. So when we think about what the endocrine system controls, they are major processes, and they are processes that either occur over long periods of time or they are ongoing, such as reproduction. The reproductive system is controlled primarily by the endocrine system. Growth and development. At one time, you were what, 6 pounds, 7 ounces, maybe a little less, maybe a little bigger, and look at you now, right? You are much larger and you look differently than you did when you were initially born. That growth and development process was controlled primarily by the endocrine system. When you get sick and your body defenses have to be mobilized, they are controlled primarily by the endocrine system. Maintenance of homeostasis, blood sugar levels, blood calcium levels, body temperature, hydration, all of those are that are related to homeostasis, dynamic equilibrium, are controlled primarily by the endocrine system. And metabolism. If you recall, metabolism is all of the chemical reactions that are occurring in your body. That is regulated primarily by the endocrine system. So I created, this is really getting on my nerves here. I created this graph, or this table rather, to sort of compare and contrast the endocrine system. We've covered the nervous system, so you're familiar with the nervous system. So I thought it would be appropriate to take what you know and apply it to what you don't know. So the nervous system and the endocrine system both control all the other organ systems. They're both controlling systems. So let's compare their basic units, their cellular organization, their method of the method by which they communicate, the route of communication, and their speed. So in the nervous system, the basic functional unit was the neuron. That's what does the communicating. In the endocrine system, it's a glandular cell. It's a cell that's found in a gland. In the nervous system, the neurons are organized into nuclei or ganglia, depending on if they're in the CNS or the PNS. In the endocrine system, they're organized into glands. In the nervous system, what was the method of communication? It was nerve impulses and neurotransmitters. The nerve impulses move through the body, through the axons, and then at a synapse, the neurotransmitter is released, which actually what communicates with the receiving cell. In the endocrine system, it's another chemical messenger, not very different from a neurotransmitter, but they're hormones because they're secreted into the blood. In the nervous system, the route of communication was via nerve fibers. In the endocrine system, it's going to be the blood. Blood is what circulates hormones. The nervous system was fast, extremely fast. The endocrine system, comparatively, is slow. Okay? So that's a good contrast and comparison between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Okay, so this is a good place to stop. It is 12:20, so I'm going to stop covering any new content. Those of you who would like to leave, you are welcome to do so. Those of you who have questions about anything, you are you are asked to stay and ask your questions. And I just got a question from Brianna about lab quizzes. Are the lab quizzes still extra credit? Yes, they are. Nothing really has changed about grading or points except the method. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.